Good evening and welcome back to Drift Through History. Most people, when they think of the great trading empires of the early modern world, think of two names, the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company, the VOC. Those are the empires that lodged themselves in popular memory. The company that became the crown of India, the VOC that was once the most valuable corporation in the history of the world. But there was a third empire, less remembered, more complicated in its story, and in some ways more interesting precisely because it failed. The French East India Company, or rather the sequence of French East India Companies, because the French managed to build, collapse, rebuild, relaunch and collapse again several times before finally conceding the contest, was one of the great might-have-beens of colonial history. At one point in the 1750s, France held more Indian territory than Britain. Its greatest general in the subcontinent was running circles around his English rivals, and the entire question of whether the Indian subcontinent would become a French or a British possession was genuinely open. A generation later it was settled, and France was gone. Tonight we're going to tell the whole story. The France of Louis XIV that tried to build a commercial empire from nothing and mostly failed, discovering in the process just how different France's relationship to commerce and to the sea was from the Dutch and English cultures that had been doing this for 60 years longer. The extraordinary interlude of John Law, the Scottish gambler who convinced France to let him effectively nationalise the economy, merged the East India Company into the greatest speculative bubble of the 18th century, and then watched the whole edifice collapse in a way that permanently traumatized French attitudes toward financial innovation. The rebuilt company of the 18th century that actually worked, that built Pondicherry into a thriving city, that extended French influence from the Carnatic coast to the courts of the Hyderabad Nizam and the Mysore Sultan, that pioneered the system of training Indian soldiers in European military tactics that both France and Britain would use to build their subcontinental empires, and then Dupleix, the most ambitious and most tragically abandoned colonial administrator in French history, a man who came closer to winning India for France than any person before or since, and who was recalled by a government that couldn't understand what he was doing until it was too late to do anything about it. This is the story of France's forgotten trading empire. It is a story about the limits of what state-directed commerce can accomplish, about the difference between a government that runs a company and a company that runs itself, about the specific handicaps and advantages of arriving late to a game that your rivals have been playing for a generation, and it is, at its end, a story about one of the most consequential roads not taken in the history of the modern world. So before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy what we do here. Drop your city and your local time in the comments below. Now dim the lights, find a comfortable position, and let your breath slow. We are going to France, to the great palace of Versailles, where a king and a minister are trying to figure out why their country is not as rich as it should be. France in 1664 was the most powerful state in continental Europe. Its army was the largest and best equipped on the continent. Its population, somewhere around 20 million people, dwarfed England's 5 million and the Dutch Republic's 2 million. Its agriculture was productive, its cities were growing, and its king was the most celebrated monarch in Christendom. And yet, when Louis XIV's finance minister Jean-Baptiste Colbert sat down to analyse the French economy, what he found alarmed him. The Dutch, with a fraction of France's population and a fraction of its agricultural resources, were richer per capita than France. Their ships carried the trade of half the world. Their merchants had organised the most sophisticated financial markets in Europe. Their East India Company, the VOC, the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, founded in 1602, was the most profitable commercial enterprise in the world, paying its shareholders dividends that made the investment the most envied in Europe. And the English, not far behind, had their own East India Company, founded in 1600, which was steadily building its position in the Indian trade. France had almost none of this, but to understand what France was missing, it helps to understand more specifically what the Dutch and British had built, because the French East India Company spent its entire existence in the shadow of these two enterprises, competing against one and modelling itself on both, and the comparison tells you something essential about why it always ran behind. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, founded in 1602 and granted a monopoly on Dutch trade east of the Cape of Good Hope, was at the time of the French company's founding the most powerful commercial enterprise in the world and arguably the most profitable business organization in the history of commerce. Its dividend payments in the 17th century averaged around 18% per year. Its fleet at its peak numbered in the hundreds of ships. It maintained its own army, minted its own coins, conducted its own foreign policy, made war and peace with Asian powers in its own name, and administered a territorial empire stretching from the Cape of Good Hope to Formosa. The VOC had, in essence, become a sovereign power in the Indian Ocean world, and it had done so by a combination of commercial intelligence, organizational sophistication, and a willingness to use violence with the efficient pragmatism of an enterprise that treated military force as simply another business tool. What made the VOC possible was the specific character of Dutch commercial culture in the 17th century. Amsterdam had become, by the 1600s, the most sophisticated financial market in the world, a market where capital could be raised for commercial ventures through joint stock companies, where shares could be traded on an organized exchange, where insurance could be purchased for maritime risks, where sophisticated credit instruments allowed merchants to deploy far more capital than they personally owned, and where the institutional knowledge of the India trade, accumulated through 2 generations of Portuguese and then Dutch commercial activity, was available as specialized expertise. When the VOC was founded in 1602, it raised 6.5 million guilders in its initial public offering, an enormous sum that reflected not just the commercial ambition of Dutch merchants, but their genuine understanding of what the trade required and what returns it could deliver. They had done the analysis. They had made the calculation. They invested because they understood the investment. The English East India Company, founded 2 years earlier than the VOC in 1600, had a different character but similar commercial DNA. It was somewhat smaller, somewhat less well capitalized, operating in a commercial culture that was less financially sophisticated than the Dutch, but more commercially active than the French. The English company had gone through several reorganizations across the 17th century, consolidating from a series of separate joint stock ventures for individual voyages into a permanent joint stock company with continuous capital in the 1650s, and by the 1660s it was a substantial commercial operation with permanent trading posts, factors, in Surat, Madras, Bombay and Calcutta. It was not yet the territorial empire it would become. It was a commercial enterprise run by merchants for profit, disciplined by the accountability to shareholders that commercial enterprise requires. France had almost none of this. French merchants, Colbert noted with the combination of frustration and calculation that characterized all his thinking, were buying spices and pepper and cinnamon and cotton and silk from Dutch and English intermediaries who had themselves purchased these things in Asia and marked them up for the European market. France was paying twice for things it could buy directly, enriching its rivals with every transaction, and contributing nothing to the development of the naval and commercial infrastructure that Colbert believed was the foundation of true national power. His diagnosis was correct. His prescription was ambitious. His execution was complicated in ways that the diagnosis had not fully accounted for. Colbert's theory of what was wrong with France and how to fix it was a variety of mercantilism, the broad economic doctrine of the 17th and early 18th centuries that identified national wealth with the accumulation of gold and silver and the establishment of a favourable balance of trade, and that argued for state intervention to produce both. Import what you can avoid importing. Export everything you can. Protect your domestic industries with tariffs. Build a merchant marine to carry your trade in your own ships. Create monopoly trading companies with royal charters that give them exclusive rights to specified markets, so that the profits of the trade flow to France rather than to foreign merchants. The Dutch and the English had done all of this, and Colbert saw clearly that France needed to do it too. What he perhaps did not see clearly enough was the specific cultural and institutional reasons why the Dutch and English had done it successfully, and why France would find it considerably harder. The Dutch East India Company had not been created by government fiat. It had emerged from a commercial culture that had been building maritime expertise and commercial organisation for decades, the herring fisheries of the North Sea that trained Dutch sailors, the grain trade of the Baltic that built Dutch merchant networks, the financial sophistication of Amsterdam that made it possible to raise enormous amounts of capital from private investors who understood trading risks and were willing to bear them. The English East India Company had similarly grown from a base of private merchant capital, organised by merchants who were trying to make money, accountable to shareholders who expected returns, and free to make commercial decisions on commercial criteria rather than political ones. Both companies were creatures of the market as much as of the state. The French commercial culture of the 1660s was something different. France was a society organised around land, nobility and the court, a society in which the most respected forms of wealth and status were agricultural, in which commerce was considered socially inferior to military service or administrative office, and in which the concentration of economic power in Paris and Versailles had starved the provincial commercial cities of the capital and the autonomy they needed to develop the kind of independent merchant culture that Amsterdam and London had built. French merchants existed, and French overseas trade existed. There were Breton and Norman sailors who had been fishing the Grand Bank since the 16th century, and there were Marseille merchants who traded actively in the Mediterranean. But the organised, risk-taking, internationally networked commercial culture that the Dutch and English East India Companies required to function did not exist in France in the form that Colbert needed it. He built the company anyway, by a combination of royal decree, administrative pressure, and barely disguised coercion. The Compagnie des Indes Orientales was chartered by royal edict in August 1664, given a 50-year monopoly on French trade east of the Cape of Good Hope, assigned administrative responsibility for Madagascar and the nearby islands of Bourbon and Ile-de-France, today's Réunion and Mauritius, and capitalised with the target of 15 million livres. Louis XIV contributed 3 million himself and encouraged the nobles of his court to invest, which they did with more enthusiasm than the merchants, who proved deeply reluctant to put their money into an enterprise that they suspected was more about royal prestige than commercial profit. The king wrote to 119 cities ordering their merchants to gather and discuss subscribing. Many refused. Colbert, who was not a man who found resistance charming, is widely believed to have pressured a significant number into investing against their will. By 1668, when the first ships were being readied for the voyage east, the king was the largest single investor, and the company was already chronically undercapitalized. The two most important appointments Colbert made in the company's first years illuminate the gap between French commercial capacity and what the trade required. But before the company could demonstrate any capacity at all, it had to survive its first decade, which it did only barely and at considerable cost in lives and money. The Madagascar colony was the most spectacular early failure, and it deserves more than a brief mention because it illustrates so clearly the specific way in which Colbert's ambitions outran the company's actual capabilities. Madagascar had been designated as the company's first major colonial project because an earlier French company, the Compagnie d'Orient, founded by Cardinal Richelieu in 1642, had already established a presence there and had been struggling unsuccessfully to build it into a viable colony. Colbert inherited both the colony and its problems, which were fundamental. Madagascar was large, hot, malarial, populated by indigenous peoples who had very little interest in French colonial settlement, and located far enough from India that its value as a strategic way station on the sea route was genuine, but its development costs were enormous. The French colonists who arrived in Madagascar in the company's first years found themselves fighting a losing battle against climate, disease and Malagasy resistance, and the death toll was catastrophic. Estimates of French mortality in Madagascar in the first decade of the company's operations run into the thousands among a colonial population that never exceeded a few hundred at any given time. Entire expeditions was destroyed. Governors died within months of arrival. The company invested money in Madagascar that it could not afford to spend and got almost nothing back. The specific character of Colbert's response to these failures tells you something important about the difference between his approach and the commercial approach. A private company answerable to shareholders would have cut its losses in Madagascar fairly quickly, redirecting capital toward operations that were actually generating returns. Colbert's company, directed from Paris by a minister who had committed France's commercial ambitions to the Indian Ocean project, and who was not going to admit failure to the king, who had invested 3 million livres in it, kept sending men and money to Madagascar long after the evidence was clear that the colony was not viable. The political logic of the state enterprise, the inability to admit failure, the commitment to a course of action regardless of commercial signals, was producing exactly the outcomes that critics of the state-directed model predicted. The eventual abandonment of Madagascar in favour of Bourbon and Île-de-France was a rational decision, but it came late and cost far more than it should have. The islands of Bourbon and Île-de-France, uninhabited when the French first encountered them, free of the indigenous resistance that had made Madagascar lethal, were colonised beginning in the 1660s and proved genuinely viable. The climate was hospitable, the soil was fertile, and the strategic location on the India route made them valuable way stations. By the early 18th century they were producing coffee, first brought from Arabia and cultivated on Bourbon with considerable commercial success, and had become the agricultural foundation of the Indian Ocean component of the French trading empire. But the Madagascar disaster had consumed a decade's worth of the company's most energetic commercial ambitions, and left a legacy of financial strain that never fully went away. François Caron, the first Director General for the India operations, was Dutch. He had spent 30 years working for the VOC, including 20 in Japan, and his entire career of relevant expertise had been acquired in service of the competitor the French company was supposed to beat. Makara of Anchintz, appointed alongside Caron as a co-director, was an Armenian merchant from Isfahan in Persia, a man whose knowledge of the Asian trading networks was invaluable, and whose nationality was French only in the most nominal sense. France was building its Eastern trading empire by hiring the people who had built everyone else's. The early years of the company were, to use the diplomatic term, instructive. The Madagascar colony that Colbert had inherited from the previous company as a supposed strategic base on the sea route to India turned out to be a graveyard for French colonists. Disease, conflict with the local Malagasy population, and the simple difficulties of establishing a European colony in an equatorial environment that no one in the French company understood took a devastating toll. The colony was eventually abandoned, replaced in French strategic thinking by the islands of Bourbon and Ile-de-France, which proved more tractable to European settlement and which would eventually become important way stations on the France-India route. The first major expedition to India, launched in 1667 and commanded by Karen, established a factory at Surat, the same busy Gujarati port city where the English and Dutch had their own trading posts, and conducted a first survey of the subcontinent's commercial landscape from Surat to Ceylon to the Coromandel coast. It was a beginning, but a modest one. The first 20 years of the company's existence were characterized by the structural contradiction that would define it throughout its history. It was a state-directed commercial enterprise trying to compete in a market where its rivals were privately directed commercial enterprises, and the difference mattered enormously. When the English East India Company's captain saw a commercial opportunity, a profitable cargo, a strategic alliance with a local ruler, a chance to establish a new trading post, they could move quickly because their decision-making chain was short and their accountability was to shareholders who rewarded profitable initiative. When the French company's captain saw the same opportunity, they had to wait for instructions from Pondicherry, which had to wait for instructions from the company's directors in Paris, which had to navigate the political interests of the royal court that effectively controlled the company in a decision-making chain that was long, slow, and oriented as much toward political considerations as commercial ones. The French company was not a merchant. It was a bureaucracy that happened to be located on ships. The story of how France eventually acquired the city of Pondicherry, the settlement that would become the anchor of French India for nearly 3 centuries, is a story of persistence against repeated setbacks that says something important about the specific qualities that French colonialism in India did possess, even when it lacked the commercial infrastructure of its rivals. The coast of southeastern India, known as the Coromandel Coast, had been of interest to French traders since the early years of the company, and a first French factory had been established at Masulipatam in 1669. But it was in 1673 that a French officer named Bélanger de l'Espinay arrived in a small fishing village called Pondicherry, obtained permission to settle from the local representative of the Sultan of Bijapur, and established the first French presence in what would become the capital of French India. The man who turned this modest foothold into something real was François Martin, who became governor of Pondicherry in 1674, and who served with interruptions until his death in 1706. Martin is one of the unsung figures of colonial history, not a dramatic military commander or a charismatic visionary, but a practical administrator of formidable patience and skill who built a city where there had been a village, maintained the French position through 2 decades of conflict and occupation, and demonstrated by the quality of his governance that the French company, whatever its structural difficulties, could produce individuals of genuine capability. He transformed Pondicherry from a small settlement into a functioning port city with proper fortifications, regular trade, and a commercial reputation that attracted Indian merchants as well as European traders. He negotiated with the Mughal governors who claimed suzerainty over the Coromandel coast, with the local Tamil rulers who actually governed it, and with the Dutch and English competitors who wanted to limit French commercial expansion. The Dutch, who during the 1670s and 1680s were fighting France in Europe in the wars that Louis XIV's ambitions had generated, attacked Pondicherry from the sea in 1693 and occupied it for 6 years, a demonstration of the vulnerability that any coastal settlement faced when its home government was at war with a naval power and could not spare ships to defend its distant possessions. Pondicherry was returned to France by the Treaty of Ryswick in 1699, and François Martin, who had spent the years of Dutch occupation making himself useful to the Dutch administration, rather than dying on a barricade, calmly resumed the task of building it into a proper French city. He had been building it for 30 years. He would keep building it until he died, and the city he left behind was substantial enough that his successors had something real to work with. The company that Martin served so loyally was, by the time of his death in 1706, already in its second period of severe financial crisis. The wars of Louis XIV, the 9 Years' War, the War of the Spanish Succession, the other military adventures through which the Sun King pursued French glory at enormous expense, had drained the French treasury, and with it the financial support that the company depended on to survive its regular shortfalls of operating capital. The company went effectively bankrupt in 1706. It was kept technically alive by a series of emergency measures and royal interventions, limping along until 1719, when it was absorbed into the extraordinary financial experiment that a Scottish gambler named John Law had persuaded the French government to let him try. John Law is one of the most remarkable figures in the history of economics, a man who understood money more clearly than almost anyone else of his era, and who used that understanding to construct a system so audaciously sophisticated that it worked for nearly 2 years before collapsing in a way that permanently damaged the French financial system's capacity for institutional innovation. His story is inseparable from the story of the French East India Company, because he absorbed the company into his scheme and made it the vehicle for the most spectacular speculative mania of the 18th century. Law was born in Edinburgh in 1671, the son of a goldsmith who had accumulated enough capital to buy a landed estate, and whose early death left the money to his son. Law was educated in banking and financial theory, displayed from a young age an unusual combination of mathematical intelligence and personal charisma, was convicted of murder in London in 1694 after killing a man in a duel over a woman, escaped from prison and fled to the continent, and spent the following decade and a half wandering through the European capitals, Amsterdam, Genoa, Venice, Turin, studying banking systems, trading in foreign exchange, gambling at cards with considerable success, and developing the theoretical framework for a monetary system that he was trying, without success, to sell to various European governments. His central idea was that a paper currency backed by land or by the productive capacity of a trading empire rather than by gold or silver could expand the money supply to match the needs of a growing economy and stimulate production and trade in ways that a metallic currency could not. It was, in its essentials, a version of what modern central banking does, and it was about a century ahead of its time. France in 1715 was the country most desperate for something like what Law was offering. Louis XIV had died, leaving a kingdom burdened by war debts so enormous that the government was effectively insolvent, interest payments consuming a proportion of tax revenues that left almost nothing for any other purpose. The regent for the child King Louis XV, the Duke of Orléans, was willing to try something drastic. He gave Law permission to establish a private bank in Paris in 1716, with the authority to issue banknotes backed by the government's promise of redemption. The bank issued notes, lent money, the economy began to move. The regent was impressed. In 1717, Law was given a further concession, the right to establish the Company of the West, with the monopoly on trade with Louisiana, the vast French territory in North America, and the rights to develop it. The company's shares were issued to the public, and Law began the financial operation that would transform the French economy for 18 extraordinary months. The mechanism was brilliant and in retrospect terrifying. Law issued shares in the Company of the West at prices that were deliberately kept attractive, offering existing holders of government debt the ability to exchange their bonds for shares at favourable rates, simultaneously reducing the government's immediate debt burden and creating a market for company stock. The company, renamed the Company of the Indies, after it absorbed a succession of other French trading companies, including the nearly defunct East India Company, expanded its operations and its stock issuance in parallel, each expansion generating demand for shares, which generated rising share prices, which generated more demand. By the end of 1719, Law had merged everything: the French East India Company, the French West India Company, the China Company, the Africa Company, the Senegal Company, the tobacco monopoly, the tax collection rights, the National Bank, into a single enormous entity that was simultaneously France's largest trading company, its central bank, its primary tax collector, and its largest employer. One company effectively was the French economy. The share price of what the Paris street traders simply called Mississippi stock, from the Company of the West's Louisiana concession, which promised riches from a territory that was mostly unexplored swamp, rose from 500 livres in early 1719 to 10,000 livres by December. It would briefly reach 18,000. The word millionaire was coined in Paris during this period. It had to be coined because the concept had not previously existed in a form that required a word. On the Rue Quincampoix, the narrow street in central Paris where Mississippi shares were traded, the crowds were so thick that people were sometimes killed in the press. A hunchback rented out his hunched back as a writing desk to those who needed to sign share certificates on the street. A cobbler made more from renting chairs to tired investors than he had ever made from mending shoes. Countesses solicited brokers. Abbots played the market. The mania was real and it was total. It was also, in its mathematical structure, a scheme whose continuation depended on stock prices continuing to rise, and whose collapse, when it came, was inevitable once enough investors decided to convert their paper profits into actual goods. The trigger was the share price's failure to keep climbing, a moment in early 1720 when some large holders began selling. The sell-off created falling prices, which created more selling, and the mechanism that had worked so powerfully in reverse began to work with equal power in the forward direction. Law, desperately trying to stabilize the situation, issued edicts that reduced the legal value of gold coins, mandating paper money's superiority, a measure so contrary to the ingrained conviction of every Frenchman that money was metal that it destroyed the last of public confidence in his system. The company's stock collapsed from its peak. Law fled France in December 1720. The Company of the Indies, stripped of its banking and tax functions, continued in a reduced form. It was reconstituted in 1723 as the French Indies Company, the Compagnie des Indes, and in this form it would operate for the next 46 years, trading with India, building Pondicherry, and eventually fighting the British for the subcontinent, before being liquidated in 1769. The Mississippi bubble left two lasting marks on France that shaped the rest of the company's story. The first was a deep, persistent, and entirely understandable suspicion among the French middle classes toward paper money and joint stock companies. A suspicion that made it chronically difficult to raise private capital for commercial ventures, and that kept French commercial culture oriented toward cautious saving rather than investment risk-taking throughout the 18th century. This was not irrational. The French who had invested in Mississippi shares had watched their savings evaporate. Their English contemporaries who had invested in the South Sea Company, a closely analogous bubble that burst in England in the same year, had experienced something similar, but England's financial culture was more elastic, its institutional memory shorter, and its recovery faster. France carried the wound from 1720 longer, and the French Indies Company that emerged from it carried the wound's consequences too. It would always find it harder to raise capital than it needed, always be more dependent on state support than its British rival, always make decisions based partly on political calculation rather than purely on commercial logic. The second mark was a more specific institutional legacy. The French Indies Company that emerged from Law's wreckage was, in its organisational structure, somewhat more commercially oriented than the Louis XIV Company had been, partly because the disruption of the Law period had cleared away some of the most cumbersome state-directed elements of the original company, and partly because the men who rebuilt it had drawn some lessons from what had failed. The reorganised company was headquartered at Lorient, and the physical reality of what the India trade required, expressed in the infrastructure of a purpose-built trading port that the company had essentially created from nothing, tells you something about the enterprise that the commercial accounts alone cannot convey. Lorient was not a natural port that the company adopted. It was a city that the company created. The site Colbert chose in 1666 was a small estuary on the South Breton coast, with adequate anchorage and access to the Atlantic, but without the existing population or infrastructure of an established port. The company built it. Warehouses, rope walks, sail lofts, dry docks, foundries for casting cannon, hospitals for sick sailors, an administrative headquarters, housing for the workers and officials and their families, everything that the India trade generated and required. By the mid-18th century, Lorient had grown into one of the most important industrial sites in France, its life entirely organised around the rhythms of the India voyages, the preparation of ships, the loading of cargo, the departure of fleets, their return, the auction of imported goods, the payment of crews. The departure of a company fleet from Lorient was one of the great spectacles of 18th century Breton life. 4, 5, 6 large East Indiamen, ships of several hundred tons carrying crews of 200 to 400 men, sitting in the roads, their holds packed with silver and manufactured goods, their gun ports open. Priests blessing the ships, families saying goodbye to men who would not be seen again for 15 months if they were seen again at all. Mortality on the India voyages was substantial, from disease above all, and the men who shipped for India knew they were taking a genuine risk. The company paid well precisely because the risk was real. The return of the fleet was a commercial event of the first importance. The calicos and chintzes, the pepper and coffee, the fine Chinese porcelains that the company also traded, arriving in Lorient and being auctioned to merchants who came from across France to buy. The auction days were the point at which the year's India trade was converted into French money, and from which the goods spread through distribution networks carrying them to Paris and Lyon and Amsterdam and London. The India that the French Indies Company was operating in by the 1720s and 1730s was a very different India from the one that François Martin had found in the 1670s. But to understand why the political collapse of the Mughal Empire mattered so much for the French company's story, it is worth understanding what the Mughal Empire at its height had actually been, because the contrast between that height and the fragmentation that followed is the context within which everything the French company attempted in India becomes intelligible. The Mughal Empire at its greatest extent, under Aurangzeb in the late 17th century, was the largest and richest state in Asia, and arguably in the world. It governed perhaps 150 million people, more than the population of all of Europe at the time, across a territory stretching from Kabul in the northwest to Bengal in the east and the Deccan Plateau in the south. Its administrative apparatus, inherited from the earlier Delhi Sultanate and refined by successive Mughal emperors, maintained a centralized system of provincial governors, subadars, and revenue collectors who extracted the agricultural surplus of the most productive agricultural territories on earth and directed it toward the imperial court at Agra and later Delhi. The wealth that this extraction produced was staggering by any contemporary standard. The peacock throne on which the Mughal emperors sat was encrusted with rubies, emeralds, diamonds, and pearls in quantities that made it the single most valuable object of artistic craftsmanship in the world. The Taj Mahal, built between 1631 and 1648 as a mausoleum for the Emperor Shah Jahan's wife Mumtaz Mahal, consumed 20 years of labour by approximately 20,000 workers and materials brought from across the Asian continent: white marble from Rajasthan, turquoise from Tibet, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, carnelian from Arabia, jade from China. This was the empire that Colbert's French East India Company was petitioning for trade rights when it sent its first agents to India in the 1660s. The Mughal Empire was not threatened by European trading companies. It tolerated them as useful sources of revenue. The customs duties they paid on their exports, the manufactured goods they brought from Europe that were valued at the imperial court, and as convenient commercial intermediaries for the Indian Ocean trade. The firman, the imperial grant of trading rights, that the French obtained from Emperor Aurangzeb in 1666 was issued by a ruler who was doing a minor administrative favour for a petitioner who brought useful things and whose military power was entirely irrelevant to the concerns of an empire that could field armies of hundreds of thousands of men. Aurangzeb's death in 1707 changed everything. He had spent the last quarter-century of his reign in a grinding war of attempted conquest against the Maratha Confederacy in the Deccan, a war he never won, that consumed enormous military and financial resources, that stretched the Mughal administrative system to its limits and beyond, and that left, on his death, a fragmented political situation in which the successor states he had spent his reign trying to suppress were now the most powerful political actors in the subcontinent. His successors on the Mughal throne were weaker men governing a weakened empire, and the governors who had been appointed to the major provinces, Hyderabad, Bengal, Awadh, the Carnatic, began to function as de facto independent rulers, acknowledging Mughal sovereignty in theory while pursuing their own political agendas in practice. The Mughal Empire, which had been the organising political reality of the Indian subcontinent for most of the 17th century, the empire of Akbar and Shah Jahan and Aurangzeb, which at its peak governed more people than any other state in the world except China, was in rapid and irreversible decline. Aurangzeb's death in 1707 had been followed by a succession of weak emperors, a fragmenting political authority, and the emergence of a series of successor states and regional powers, the Marathas in the Deccan and Western India, the Nawabs of Awadh and Bengal, the Nizam of Hyderabad, the rulers of the Carnatic and Mysore, that were simultaneously more locally powerful than the Mughal governors they were replacing, and more susceptible to the kind of external intervention that the European trading companies, with their military resources and their commercial networks, were uniquely positioned to provide. The decline of Mughal authority created, in practical terms, a market for military power in the Indian subcontinent. Local rulers who were competing for territory and legitimacy against their neighbours were willing to pay for European military assistance, for the trained soldiers, the artillery, the fortification expertise, the naval support that the European companies could provide, in ways that the stable Mughal order of the 17th century had not needed and would not have permitted. The French and British companies began in the 1730s and 1740s to offer exactly this kind of assistance in exchange for trade concessions, territorial grants, and the revenue rights that gave them an economic stake in the political outcomes they were helping to produce. The French settlements in India by the 1730s had grown from the single factory at Surat and the founding settlement at Pondicherry into a network of trading posts and enclaves along the Coromandel and Malabar coasts and in Bengal. Pondicherry itself had grown into a substantial city. Population estimates for the 1740s suggest somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 people, making it larger than contemporary Boston or Philadelphia and comparable to contemporary Edinburgh. Its layout reflected the specific social geography of French India. The White Town, where the French administrators and merchants lived in a planned grid of straight streets with European-style buildings, and the Black Town, where the much larger Indian population, Tamil weavers, merchants, craftsmen, servants, sepoys, lived in a denser, organically organized settlement that provided the actual economic and human foundation of the French enterprise. Chandernagore in Bengal, Mahé on the Malabar coast, Yanam and Karaikal on the Coromandel, the settlements in the northern Sircars, the French had built a genuine archipelago of commercial and eventually territorial presence along the coasts of the subcontinent. Before we move to the commodity trade, it is worth pausing in Pondicherry itself, in the physical reality of the city at its height, because the French East India Company was not only a set of commercial transactions and military confrontations, it was also a place, a way of living, a specific social world that the intersection of French colonial ambition and Tamil coastal culture produced, and that world deserves its own attention. The Pondicherry of the mid-18th century was organised around the fundamental social division that characterised all European colonial settlements in Asia. The European town and the Indian town, separated spatially, governed by different legal systems, embodying different cultural assumptions, and yet economically and socially entangled in ways that neither the European colonial ideology nor the Indian social tradition entirely anticipated. The White Town of Pondicherry, laid out on a regular grid with the systematic rationalism of French colonial planning, contained the governor's residence, the company's administrative offices, the Catholic churches that were the focal points of French religious life in the settlement, the residences of the European merchants and officials, and the warehouses, counting houses, and quays of the commercial district. The streets were straight. The buildings were built in an approximation of French colonial style that adapted European architectural vocabulary to the Tamil climate. High ceilings for ventilation, deep verandas for shade, courtyards for cross breezes, and the visual impression was of a small French provincial town that had been transported, somewhat baffled, to the Coromandel coast. The black town that surrounded and substantially outnumbered the white town was a very different place, organised not by colonial planning but by the pre-existing social geography of Tamil coastal society. The caste neighbourhoods, the temple complexes, the market areas, the weavers' quarters where the skilled artisans who produced the cotton textiles that were the company's most important commercial product lived and worked. The weavers of the Coromandel coast were the economic foundation of the entire French enterprise in India. Without their skill and their production, the fine muslins, the painted chintzes, the block-printed calicoes that French merchants were shipping to Lorient, there was no commerce to justify the company's Indian presence. The relationship between the company and the weavers was the central economic relationship of the settlement, and it was a relationship of asymmetric power. The company had access to credit, to European markets, and to the political authority of the colonial establishment. The weavers had the skill and the production, and had to negotiate with an institution that held all the structural advantages. The French company's agents, the factors who managed the company's purchasing operations, advanced money to weavers to fund the purchase of thread and the production of cloth to the company's specifications in a system of debt bondage that was not quite slavery, but that bound weavers to the company through financial obligation in ways that severely limited their economic freedom. The weavers could not sell their cloth to other buyers if they owed money to the company, and the company's purchasing prices were set unilaterally by the company's agents rather than by market negotiation. The system was essentially the same system that the British East India Company was using in Bengal and the Dutch in Batavia. The structural exploitation of the Asian artisan class by the European commercial monopoly was not a specifically French vice, but a general feature of the colonial trading company wherever it operated. The commodity that the French company was primarily seeking in India was the same thing that had drawn every European power to the subcontinent: textiles. The cotton cloth of the Coromandel coast, the calicoes and chintzes and muslins and painted cloths that were flowing out of India's weaving communities in quantities that European consumers found irresistible and European textile manufacturers found threatening, was the primary product of the India trade throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, more valuable than spices by the time the French company was established, and the foundation on which the profits of the India trade rested. The French company was buying textiles from Indian weavers and artisans, shipping them to Lorient and selling them in France and across Europe at prices that reflected both the quality of Indian cloth and the markup that a monopoly trading company with its own fleet could extract. Alongside textiles came coffee from Bourbon, pepper and other spices from the Malabar coast, indigo and saltpeter, and the various luxury goods, diamonds, pearls, fine silks, carved ivory, that the Indian Ocean trade had always carried. The specific economics of the company's India trade were precarious, but the trade itself was real, and the specific things moving in both directions between France and the Indian Ocean world deserve attention, because they illuminate what the company was actually for in its commercial rather than its imperial dimension. From India to France, the dominant commodity was textiles, specifically the cotton cloth of the Coromandel coast and to a lesser extent Bengal, in a dazzling variety of weaves and finishes and printed patterns that European consumers found irresistible and European manufacturers found threatening. Calicoes, chintzes, muslins, painted and dyed cottons in patterns that combined Indian aesthetic traditions with European commercial tastes. The company's agents in Pondicherry and Chandanagore worked with Indian weavers and merchants to produce cloth that would sell in Lorient and Paris, adjusting the colours, the patterns and the weave weights to the specifications that European markets demanded. The painted cottons of the Coromandel coast, the printed and hand-painted fabrics whose colours remained fast through washing in ways that European dyers had not yet mastered, were among the most prized textiles in 17th and 18th century Europe, and the vogue for Indian printed cottons, which the French called indiennes, was so intense that it threatened the French domestic textile industry and generated the prohibitions that Colbert and his successors enacted against certain categories of Indian cloth. Alongside the textiles came pepper and other spices from the Malabar coast, though the spice trade was less central to the French company than it had been to the Portuguese who pioneered the Indian Ocean trade and the Dutch who dominated it in the 17th century. By the time the French company was established, the price of spices in Europe had fallen substantially from the levels that had made the spice trade the most valuable commerce in the world, and the trade was no longer the driver of the enterprise that it once had been. Coffee from Bourbon was increasingly important as the 18th century progressed. The island's coffee production was growing rapidly, and French coffee consumption was growing with it, making bourbon coffee a significant revenue stream for the company and transforming the island's economy in the process. From France to India, the company was carrying silver above all, the structural problem of the European-Asian trade that afflicted every company and every country that engaged in it. Europe produced few manufactured goods that Indian consumers wanted in the quantities that European consumers wanted Asian goods, and the resulting trade imbalance had to be closed with silver, which meant that the company was exporting the precious metal that mercantilism identified as the foundation of national wealth. This contradiction, that the trade that was supposed to enrich France was requiring a steady outflow of French silver, was recognized by Colbert and his successors, and generated various attempts to find European manufactured goods that Indian consumers would accept in place of silver. Some success was achieved with certain luxury goods, French wines, glassware, mirrors, mechanical clocks, that appealed to Indian courts. But the structural imbalance persisted throughout the company's existence, and the silver outflow was one of the persistent arguments against the India trade in the ongoing French internal debate about whether the enterprise was worth its cost. The specific economics of the company's India trade were precarious in ways that the structure of the French economy made worse. But before we reach that precariousness, it is worth dwelling on what the trade actually did to French material culture, because the French East India Company's commercial operations, whatever their financial difficulties, had a genuine and lasting cultural impact on the society they were supposed to serve. The Indian printed cottons that the company was importing, the block-printed chintzes and painted calicoes, the fine muslins, the embroidered silks, created in France a vogue for Indian textile aesthetics that transformed the visual culture of French decorative arts in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. The craze for what the French called indienne was so intense that it alarmed French textile manufacturers, who lobbied successfully for prohibitions on certain categories of Indian imported cloth. But prohibition did not kill the fashion. It simply shifted French manufacturers toward imitation, and the Provence workshops that produced imitation Indian printed cottons. The Provençal indienne that now associated in the popular imagination with French textile tradition were created precisely because the genuine article was too popular to compete with by normal commercial means. The influence of Indian aesthetic traditions on French decorative art in this period is visible in the chinoiserie style that saturated French interiors, furniture and porcelain in the early 18th century, a style that mixed Indian, Chinese and Japanese visual elements with European decorative vocabulary in a synthesis that was specifically French rather than specifically Asian, the product of imagination working on imperfect knowledge at a creative distance. The coffee that the company was importing from Bourbon and eventually from other sources became, in the 18th century, one of the defining features of French social life. The Parisian café culture that was developing throughout the 18th century, the coffee houses where men read newspapers, argued politics, formed friendships, and conducted intellectual life, was a culture made possible by the India's trade that was supplying its central commodity. The Café de la Régence, the Café Procope, and dozens of other Parisian establishments were consuming enormous quantities of coffee that the company's Bourbon operations had helped produce. The financial crisis of John Law's system was debated in coffee houses over coffee that the company's ships had carried from the Indian Ocean. The philosophers of the Enlightenment, Voltaire was said to drink 50 cups a day, an impressive and probably apocryphal figure, were caffeinated on trade that the company had organized. The porcelain that the company imported from China alongside its Indian goods, the blue and white and polychrome wares that French aristocratic households acquired in enormous quantities through the company's auctions at Lorient, created a demand for European imitation that drove the development of the European porcelain industry. The Vincennes factory and its successor, the Sèvres porcelain manufactory, that Louis XV established as a royal enterprise, owed its existence partly to the desire to produce for European consumers something comparable to the Chinese wares that the India companies were importing. The Sèvres porcelain that became one of the most prestigious luxury goods in 18th century Europe, the diplomatic gift of choice for French kings, the status symbol of choice for European aristocracy, was the European answer to the Asian goods that the company had been importing. The French market for Indian textiles was substantial, but it was also a market that French textile manufacturers were politically powerful enough to restrict. Colbert himself had enacted prohibitions on certain Indian printed cottons to protect French domestic producers, and these protections were maintained and extended throughout the 18th century in ways that limited the company's most profitable product lines. The French consumer market was also smaller and less commercially sophisticated than the English market that the British East India Company was serving, both because France was less urbanized and because the financial underdevelopment of French commercial culture that the Mississippi bubble had deepened made credit-based commerce more difficult. The French company was competing against the British company in a market where the British company had structural advantages in capital, in commercial infrastructure, and in the domestic demand that made the trade profitable enough to justify the investment. And yet the company survived, and in its middle decades, roughly from the 1720s to the 1750s, it even prospered. The coffee trade from Bourbon was genuinely profitable. The textile trade with India, despite the restrictions, generated real returns. The company's ships departing Lorient on the long voyage around the Cape of Good Hope to the Indian Ocean were carrying cargo that was valuable enough and trading conditions that were manageable enough that the enterprise made commercial sense. What transformed the company from a moderately successful trade operation into a would-be territorial empire, and what ultimately destroyed it, was the specific genius and the specific tragedy of Joseph-François Dupleix. Dupleix was born in 1697 in Landrecies in northern France, the son of a wealthy financier connected to the French East India Company's administration. He joined the company at 18, arrived in India in 1720, served in Pondicherry and then in Chandernagore in Bengal, where he served as governor from 1730 to 1741 with considerable commercial success. building the Bengal settlements trade into the most profitable of the company's Indian operations. In 1742 he was appointed Governor-General of all French settlements in India, headquartered at Pondicherry, and it was in this position that he began the grand experiment that transformed the history of European India. Dupleix's insight was simple in its formulation and almost impossibly complex in its execution, and to understand it properly you need to understand the man who formulated it, because Dupleix was not simply a bureaucrat executing a policy. He was a person of genuine imperial vision, enormous personal ambition, and unusual practical intelligence, operating at the intersection of European commercial politics and Indian court politics in a way that required facility in both worlds simultaneously. He was also, perhaps unusually for the great figures of European colonial history, substantially assisted by his wife. Jeanne Dupleix, born Jeanne Albert, the widow of a former governor of Chandernagore when she married Dupleix in 1742, was not a background figure in her husband's career. She was an active participant in the political life of Pondicherry, maintaining relationships with Indian merchants and nobles that complemented her husband's official connections, organising intelligence about the movements and intentions of British and Indian actors that informed French decision-making, and serving as a diplomatic figure in her own right in the specifically Indian political contexts where direct French official engagement was impractical. Indian historical sources from the period mention her with a respect that suggests she was understood as a significant figure rather than merely the Governor-General's spouse. European sources, written by men who are not accustomed to crediting women with political agency, are less forthcoming. The balance of the evidence suggests that she was genuinely important to the operation that bore her husband's name. Dupleix's insight was simple in its formulation and almost impossibly complex in its execution, that the key to French power in India was not commercial but political. The British East India Company and the French Company were roughly evenly matched in their commercial resources. Neither had the manpower or the resources to simply conquer the Indian subcontinent by force. The armies they could afford to maintain in India were tiny compared to the forces of the great Indian successor states, but the successor states were fighting each other constantly over succession disputes in the Carnatic and Hyderabad and throughout the Deccan, and what they lacked was not soldiers but military quality. Indian armies were enormous but often poorly organised, poorly equipped with modern firepower, and led by commanders who had not developed the tactical sophistication that European military drill and European artillery technique provided. A small force of European soldiers and Indian soldiers trained in European methods could be decisive in the battles between Indian successor states. And if you were decisive in those battles, if you provided the military capability that determined who won, you acquired enormous political influence over the winner, which translated into territorial grants and revenue rights and trade concessions of enormous value. Dupleix was not the first European in India to understand this logic. The English had been experimenting with it too, but Dupleix implemented it more systematically and more ambitiously than anyone had previously attempted, and the results, in the years between 1746 and 1751, were breathtaking. In 1746, war broke out between France and Britain as an extension of the War of the Austrian Succession, and a French fleet under Admiral La Bourdonnais captured Madras, the British East India Company's principal settlement on the Coromandel coast. Dupleix tried to hold Madras as a permanent French possession. La Bourdonnais, to whom he had promised the governor that the city would be ransomed rather than held, overruled him and accepted a ransom. The capture and return of Madras, and the arguments about its disposition, revealed both the potential of the French military position in southern India and the internal divisions that would limit it. The peace that followed, the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748, which ended the War of the Austrian Succession in Europe and required the mutual restitution of colonial conquests, returned Madras to the British and Louisbourg in Canada to France in the colonial settlement, a swap that satisfied neither side and that both sides immediately began to undermine. In India, Dupleix responded to the enforced peace by pursuing his political strategy through other means, by intervening directly in the succession disputes of the Carnatic and Hyderabad in ways that were not technically acts of war between France and Britain, but that were designed to establish French-backed rulers in these key territories and thereby outflank British influence. The succession dispute in the Carnatic, the coastal territory whose capital was Arcot, cannot be properly understood without understanding who the Indian players were, because the Carnatic Wars were not simply a Franco-British conflict played out on Indian soil. They were also a genuinely Indian political crisis, in which Indian rulers with their own interests and ambitions were making their own calculations about the best European partner to align with, and the choices they made were as consequential as anything Dupleix or Clive decided. The Carnatic, the territorial region along the southeastern Coromandel coast, roughly corresponding to the northern part of modern Tamil Nadu, was nominally subject to the Nizam of Hyderabad, who was himself nominally a Mughal governor, but who had been functioning as an independent ruler since the 1720s. The Nawab of the Carnatic, the Nizam's appointed subordinate governor, exercised day-to-day authority over the region, but the Nawabship was not a peaceful hereditary office. It was contested among rival claimants whose competing claims drew in both the Nizam's court and, increasingly, the European trading companies whose military resources could tip the balance in any succession dispute. When Anwaruddin Khan died in 1749, the Nawabship was claimed by his son Muhammad Ali on one side and by Chanda Sahib on the other. Muhammad Ali had British support, Chanda Sahib had French. But Chanda Sahib's claim was not simply a French puppet's. He had his own legitimacy, his own following, and his own political vision for the Carnatic that was at least partially independent of French interests. The Indian ruler who aligned with a European company was making a bet on who would be the dominant power in the region, and the bet was not irrational. The question was genuinely open in 1749, and the European company's military capabilities were real and relevant to the outcome of Indian succession disputes in ways that they had not been 2 generations earlier. Similarly in Hyderabad, where Dupleix's ally Muzaffar Jung was competing for the Nizamship against the British-backed Nasir Jung, the politics were those of a genuine Indian court with genuine Indian stakes, not merely a proxy for European commercial rivalry. The French officers who helped install Muzaffar Jung, and who, in the person of the remarkable Marquis de Bussy, maintained French influence at the Hyderabad court for 7 subsequent years, were operating in a world of Indian political complexity that could not be reduced to the simple binary of French interest versus British interest. Bussy's success in Hyderabad was partly a success of genuine diplomatic skill, of understanding the specific dynamics of the Hyderabad court, of building personal relationships with the Nizam and his officials that were valued independently of the military backing that the French provided. The succession dispute in the Carnatic, the coastal territory whose capital was Arcot, became the terrain on which the competition between Dupleix and the British played out in its most dramatic form. Dupleix supported Chanda Sahib's claim to the Nawabship of the Carnatic against the British-backed Muhammad Ali. The military campaigns that followed in 1749 and 1750 saw Dupleix's forces and his Indian allies achieving considerable success. Chanda Sahib was installed as Nawab. French influence extended across a large swath of southern India, and Dupleix himself was awarded the honorary title of governor of all the territory from the Krishna River to the southern tip of the subcontinent by his grateful Indian allies. At his peak in 1751, Dupleix controlled more Indian territory and more Indian political influence than any European had ever possessed. The French flag flew over a string of interior forts and coastal settlements that collectively made France the paramount European power on the Coromandel coast. And then a 26-year-old British officer named Robert Clive arrived in the picture. Clive had come to India as a company clerk, had taken a military commission during the War of the Austrian Succession, and had demonstrated at the siege of Trichinopoli an aggression and a willingness to take risk that distinguished him from the more cautious officers around him. In September 1751, Clive proposed and executed what should, by any rational analysis, have been an insane operation. With 500 men, 200 Europeans and 300 Indian sepoys, he attacked and captured Arcot, the capital of the Carnatic, the seat of the Nawabship that Chanda Sahib claimed and that Dupleix had installed him in. He did it in the middle of the monsoon at night, having marched his small force through a storm that the garrison apparently interpreted as evidence that anyone attacking in such weather was too terrifying to resist. He then held Arcot for 53 days against a combined Franco-Indian force of several thousand men in one of the most improbable defensive stands in colonial military history. The siege of Arcot did not end the contest. The Carnatic Wars would continue for years, but it changed the psychological atmosphere of the competition. Clive had demonstrated that British forces could match Dupleix's methods. The same aggressive intervention in Indian politics, the same use of Indian troops trained in European methods, the same combination of European firepower and Indian numerical strength. And the British East India Company, crucially, was willing to back Clive's initiatives with capital and reinforcements in ways that the French government was increasingly reluctant to do for Dupleix. This was the structural weakness that Dupleix could never overcome, however brilliantly he manoeuvred. The French Indies Company was a state enterprise, and the French state's relationship to its colonial operations was fundamentally different from the British government's relationship to the British East India Company. The British Company was a private enterprise whose profits went to shareholders who had an incentive to reinvest them in the operations that generated them. When Clive needed money for a military campaign, the company's directors in London might argue about it, might take longer than Clive would have liked, but they eventually sent it because failure in India would cost them money. When Dupleix needed money for his campaigns, he had to persuade the company's directors in Paris, who had to persuade the government, and the government's calculation was political as much as commercial. What would this cost? What would France get? Was there a diplomatic solution that would achieve the same ends without the expense of a military campaign? The French government, distracted by the diplomatic situation in Europe and constitutionally suspicious of the kind of aggressive territorial expansion that Dupleix was pursuing in his own name, and apparently without explicit authorization, was also receiving negative reports about Dupleix from his enemies within the company. Directors who found his independent initiatives alarming, officers who resented his authority, traders whose commercial operations his military campaigns were disrupting. The combination of governmental caution and bureaucratic opposition produced the decision that determined the outcome of the Anglo-French struggle for India. In 1754, the French government recalled Dupleix. He arrived home in France to find himself blamed for the expense of his campaigns and denied the recognition he'd expected for their achievements. He spent his remaining years writing memoirs, presenting petitions to the government, and watching the British consolidate the position in southern India that he had nearly taken from them. He died in 1763, nearly bankrupt, his fortune spent on the campaigns whose costs the government refused to reimburse, in the same year that the Treaty of Paris settled the 7 Years' War and confirmed British supremacy in India. His replacement in India had already undone most of what he had built. The 7 Years' War, fought in Europe from 1756 to 1763, but experienced simultaneously on 3 continents, in North America, in Africa, and in India, was the conflict that finally decided the Anglo-French competition for the subcontinent. But to understand why India was part of this conflict at all, it helps to understand what kind of war the 7 Years' War was, because it was something genuinely new in the history of European warfare. Previous European wars had been primarily continental affairs with colonial sideshows. Armies fought in the Netherlands, in Germany, in Italy, while trading companies in the colonies engaged in their own lower-level conflicts that were sometimes connected to the European war and sometimes running on their own momentum. The 7 Years' War was the first conflict in which the colonial theatre was as important as the continental one, in which battles fought on the Ohio River and the Coromandel coast and the Bengal Delta mattered as much to the eventual outcome as battles fought in Silesia and Bohemia. This global character was not an accident. It was the product of the previous century's colonial competition, which had created British and French empires scattered across 4 continents that were simultaneously stakes in the war and instruments through which it was fought. For Britain, the colonies were the source of commercial wealth that funded the war effort. For France, attacking those colonies was the way to hurt Britain without fighting on land where France had no advantage. The specific alliance structure of the 7 Years' War, France allied with Austria and Russia against Britain allied with Prussia, meant that the war's European and colonial dimensions were not neatly aligned with French and British interests in all cases. France was spending enormous military and financial resources fighting alongside Austria in Europe, resources that could not simultaneously be devoted to the colonial struggle with Britain. The British had the advantage of a continental ally in Prussia that could absorb French military attention on the continent, while British resources were freed for the naval and colonial war. William Pitt the Elder, who directed British strategy in the war with unusual strategic clarity, articulated this explicitly. Britain would win the colonial war by funding Prussia to fight the continental one, leaving British naval and military power free to operate in North America, the Caribbean, West Africa, and India simultaneously. The results of this strategic allocation were devastating for France. The fall of Quebec in 1759, which ended French Canada, the fall of Pondicherry in 1761, which ended the French military presence in India, the conquest of various French Caribbean islands. France emerged from the Treaty of Paris in 1763, having lost most of the empire it had been building for a century. The peace settlement restored some of what was lost. Pondicherry was returned, Canada was not, but the terms of restoration, as we have noted, neutered what was returned by prohibiting its fortification. France got its trading posts back, but not the power to defend them. In India, it took the form of the Third Carnatic War, and its central military events were the Battle of Plassey in 1757, which established British dominance in Bengal, the richest province of the Indian subcontinent, and the Battle of Wandiwash in 1760, which effectively ended French military power in southern India. The French sent Count Thomas Arthur de Lally to India in 1758 as their new military commander, and his story is as much a story about the French state's relationship to its colonial enterprise as it is about his personal failures, which were real, but which were also substantially the product of the structural conditions he had been sent into. Lally was not a fool and not a coward. He was born in 1702 to an Irish Jacobite family. His father had been one of the Wild Geese, the Irish Catholic soldiers who had followed James II into exile after the Glorious Revolution, and who served in the French-Irish Brigade, one of the most distinguished foreign formations in the French army. Thomas Arthur de Lally had followed his father into the brigade, had fought at Dettingen and Fontenoy, had been present at Charles Edward Stuart's rising in Scotland in 1745, and was by 1756 one of the most decorated officers in France. He was chosen for the India command partly because of his military reputation, and partly because of his family's Irish identity. It was hoped that his background would help him connect with the Irish soldiers who served throughout the French military in India, and particularly with the Marquis de Bussy, whose cooperation he would need to coordinate the French military effort across the subcontinent. The problems that Lally encountered in India were, in their essentials, the same problems that had haunted the French enterprise from the beginning, now concentrated into crisis form by the demands of an active war: inadequate capital, unreliable naval support, divided command, and a home government that was simultaneously demanding results and refusing to provide the resources that results required. His troops had not been paid for months when he arrived. The company's perennial underfunding had reached a critical stage, with soldiers and officers resentful and demoralized before a shot had been fired. The French naval presence in Indian waters, which was essential for maintaining the supply lines to Pondicherry and for preventing the British from using their sea power to choke off French operations, was intermittent and ultimately insufficient. Admiral Dupleix, the French naval commander, made the decision to withdraw his fleet from Indian waters in 1758, citing the damage his ships had sustained in the engagement at Cuddalore, and the impossibility of operating without an adequate port for repair and resupply, a decision that left Lally's army without the naval shield it needed to sustain offensive operations. The decision to recall Bussy from Hyderabad was Lally's most consequential and most criticised choice, and in the light of the subsequent campaign it is difficult to defend. Bussy had spent 7 years building French influence at the Nizam's court with extraordinary success, maintaining a French military presence in the interior that was simultaneously a strategic asset and a source of revenue. The territory that the Nizam had granted France in exchange for Bussy's military services generated the Jagir income that was the closest thing the French establishment in India had to a reliable financial base, independent of the company's chronically inadequate remittances from Lorient. Lally recalled Bussy to strengthen the force for the siege of Madras, which was a reasonable tactical decision made without adequate appreciation of the strategic cost. When Bussy left Hyderabad, French influence there evaporated immediately. The interior was lost, the Jagar revenue was lost, and the Indian alliance network that Dupleix had spent a decade building and Bussy had spent 7 years maintaining collapsed in months. The French sent Count Thomas Arthur de Lally to India in 1758 as their new military commander, replacing the cautious administrators who had governed since Dupleix's recall with a soldier who had a formidable European reputation and who approached his Indian assignment with the confidence of a man who had spent his career winning battles against conventional European opponents. Lally had significant disadvantages from the start. He arrived without naval support. The French navy, spread thin by the global war, could not provide the sustained maritime presence that controlling the Indian coast required. He arrived without adequate funds, The company's finances were again in crisis, and his troops went months without pay, which severely damaged their morale and their effectiveness. He arrived without the network of Indian allies that Dupleix had spent years building, because the recall of Dupleix and the compromises made in its aftermath had alienated many of the Indian rulers who had been France's partners. Lally's initial campaign in 1758 included an attack on Fort St. David, the British settlement south of Pondicherry, which he took, and a siege of Madras, which he failed to take. The garrison held on through the monsoon season until a British relief fleet arrived and ended the siege. The failure at Madras, combined with his recall of the Marquis de Bussy from the Hyderabad court, Bussy had been maintaining French political influence in the Deccan for 7 years through a combination of military skill and diplomatic finesse, and his recall removed the main instrument of French influence in the interior, left the French in the worst possible position, unable to advance and unable to supply themselves from the territories they nominally controlled. Eyre Coote, the British commander in southern India, was a careful and methodical soldier who understood his opponent's vulnerabilities and exploited them with professional thoroughness. On January 23, 1760, at the fort of Wandiwash in Tamil Nadu, Coote's force of approximately 1,700 men engaged Lally's force of approximately 2,000. Lally opened with an artillery bombardment and a cavalry charge that he expected to sweep the British artillery aside. The cavalry was met with disciplined musket fire and stopped. A lucky British artillery shot detonated the French powder magazine, causing catastrophic damage to the French left flank. Coote pressed the advantage on the disorganized French left, and the entire French line collapsed. The Marquis de Bussy was captured. Lally retreated to Pondicherry, where Coote besieged him with land and sea forces through the rest of 1760 and into January 1761. The siege of Pondicherry was the end of the dream. Lally, cut off by sea and surrounded by land, his food supplies exhausted and his garrison reduced to eating dogs and rats in the final weeks, negotiated a surrender on January 15, 1761. The British accepted. Pondicherry was razed. The British commanders ordered its fortifications demolished, its buildings pulled down, its urban infrastructure destroyed in a thoroughness that went beyond military necessity into something that looked more like a statement. This city will not be available to threaten us again. The French city that François Martin had spent 30 years building, that Dupleix had governed and expanded, that had been the capital of a would-be French empire in India, was reduced to rubble. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 returned Pondicherry and the other French settlements to France, but with a condition that made the return almost meaningless. France was prohibited from fortifying them. The trading posts could resume their commercial function. The military power that had made them the basis of a potential empire could not be rebuilt. Pondicherry was returned as a town without walls, commercially viable but politically neutered, a place where French merchants could do business but not a base from which French power could project itself into the interior. Lally himself was returned to France, tried for alleged treason and incompetence, and executed by beheading in 1766, a death that Voltaire, who had followed the trial, called a judicial assassination, and that posterity has generally agreed was at minimum a scapegoating of the commander for the government's own failures of support. His son spent decades working to have the verdict overturned and eventually succeeded in 1778. The French Indies Company was formally liquidated in 1769, its possessions handed over to the French crown, its operations wound down. But the story of France's relationship to India did not end there. It transformed. taking different forms across the remaining decades of the old regime and into the revolutionary and Napoleonic periods that followed. The 20 years between the liquidation of the company in 1769 and the French Revolution in 1789 saw an attempt to continue the India trade under direct government management. The Crown took over the company's trading monopoly and its Indian settlements. That proved even less commercially successful than the company had been. Without the organisational infrastructure of a dedicated trading company, with the India trade managed by royal officials whose primary skill was administration rather than commerce, the volume of French trade with India fell substantially. Private French merchants who had previously operated outside the company's monopoly pushed for liberalisation, and in 1790 the revolutionary government finally abolished the monopoly entirely, opening the India trade to all French merchants. The timing was not ideal. France was in the middle of a revolution, and the priorities of the revolutionary government were not commercial expansion in the Indian Ocean. The French Revolution and the subsequent Napoleonic Wars gave France's relationship to India one last extraordinary chapter. Napoleon, whose strategic imagination encompassed the entire connected world that the previous century's imperial competition had created, saw India not as a commercial opportunity, but as the place where Britain was most vulnerable, the source of the wealth that funded Britain's endless wars against France, the colony whose loss would cripple British power more effectively than any continental victory. His Egyptian campaign of 1798 was, in part, an attempt to position France for a thrust toward India overland, through Egypt, across the Ottoman territories, into Persia and Afghanistan. It failed for many reasons, including Nelson's destruction of the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile, but the strategic logic behind it, that attacking British India through the back door was the most effective way to wound British power, was not wrong. It was simply beyond French capabilities in 1798 to execute. Napoleon's correspondence with Tipu Sultan, the ruler of Mysore, who was the most effective Indian opponent of British expansion in the late 18th century, is one of the more tantalizing might-have-beens of the period. Tipu was actively seeking French military support against the British. He sent embassies to France. He incorporated French revolutionary symbolism into his court. He planted the Tree of Liberty in his capital and called himself the Citizen Tipu. Napoleon was interested in principle but unable to deliver in practice. The British defeated and killed Tipu at Seringapatam in 1799, before any French assistance could arrive, and with Tipu's death the last credible Indian resistance to British dominion in southern India was destroyed. The state absorbed the trade, such as it was, into direct royal management, but without the company's organisational structure and commercial expertise, the India trade withered further. France retained Pondicherry and the other settlements as colonial possessions. They would continue as French India until 1954, when they were peacefully transferred to the Republic of India, making them among the last European colonial territories to be relinquished in Asia. But the commercial and political empire that Colbert had envisioned and Dupleix had nearly built was over. The comparison between the British and French India companies is one that European and especially British historiography has analysed extensively. What it has analysed less is what the Indian perspective on this competition was, how the Indian rulers and merchants and artisans who were the objects of the competition experienced it, what choices they made within it, and what those choices tell us about the agency that Indian actors possessed, even in a situation that the colonial narrative tends to present as simply imposed from outside. The Indian rulers who allied with either the French or the British in the Carnatic Wars were not passive victims of European manipulation. They were active political agents making their own calculations about the best way to navigate a rapidly changing political environment in which Mughal authority was collapsing. Neighbouring states were opportunistically expanding, and two well-armed European companies were offering military assistance in exchange for territorial and commercial concessions. The Nizam of Hyderabad, who shifted his alliance between French and British backing at various points in the mid-18th century, was doing what Indian rulers had always done, seeking the most useful external support against immediate threats and recalibrating as the balance of advantage shifted. That the European companies eventually proved more consequential than he had calculated was not a failure of Indian political intelligence, but a consequence of the specific way in which the 7 Years' War and the subsequent peace settlement transformed the balance of power in ways that no Indian ruler in 1750 could have fully anticipated. The Indian merchants who worked with the French company in Pondicherry, the Tamil brokers and agents, the Armenian traders who operated across the entire Indian Ocean commercial network, the chettiars who provided the credit that the company's commercial operations required, were similarly not passive recipients of European commercial exploitation. They were sophisticated commercial actors who were using the European company's presence in India for their own purposes, accessing European markets through the company's trade, using the company's legal and administrative infrastructure for their own disputes, and participating in the colonial commercial order in ways that served their own interests, even as those interests were constrained by the asymmetric power of the colonial relationship. The specific Indian commercial networks that worked with the French company in Pondicherry were some of the same networks that worked with the British company in Madras, and with the Dutch in Batavia, and with the Portuguese in Goa. Versatile commercial actors whose ability to work within multiple colonial systems simultaneously gave them a flexibility that the European companies themselves lacked, whose competition effectively built the institutional framework of British India, is one of the most studied questions in the history of European colonialism, and the reasons for the French failure and the British success have been analysed from many angles. Some explanations focus on the structural. The British company was a private enterprise answerable to shareholders, while the French company was a state enterprise answerable to the government, and the differences in decision-making speed and commercial orientation this produced were consistently disadvantageous to France. Some focus on the financial. Britain's more developed capital markets allowed the British company to raise money more easily, respond to opportunities more quickly, and sustain losses that would have ended the French company's India operations entirely. Some focus on the geographic. Britain's location gave it naval advantages in the Atlantic that translated into advantages in the Indian Ocean, and the British Navy's consistent superiority throughout the 7 Years' War meant that France could never guarantee the sea lanes that its India operations required. Some focus on the personal, that Clive was a more decisive and more resourceful commander than Lally, that the British company produced more consistently capable administrators, that Dupleix's recall at the crucial moment was a catastrophic own goal. There is truth in all of these, and the most honest conclusion is probably that France's failure in India was overdetermined, that multiple reinforcing disadvantages were working against the French company throughout its history, and that the British company had multiple reinforcing advantages that accumulated over time into an asymmetry that individual brilliance like Dupleix could temporarily challenge but not ultimately overcome. But there is also a counterfactual worth holding. Dupleix was not recalled because his strategy was failing. He was recalled in 1754 because the French government did not understand his strategy and was frightened by its cost, because the short-term expense of maintaining his campaigns was more visible to Paris than the long-term strategic position he was building. In 1754, when he was recalled, the French controlled more Indian territory than the British. The contest was not decided. The 7 Years' War that settled it definitively began only in 1756, 2 years after his recall. If Dupleix had been given 2 more years, if the French government had understood what he was doing and continued to support it, the Battle of Wandiwash, which was decided by a lucky artillery shot, might have gone differently. The siege of Pondicherry, which was decided by the lack of a French naval presence to break the British blockade, might not have happened. The British Empire in India, whose foundations were laid between 1754 and 1763, might have had a very different shape. This is speculation, and history resists its cleaner counterfactuals. But the possibility is real enough that the French East India Company's story is not simply the story of an enterprise that always failed. It is the story of an enterprise that very nearly succeeded, that produced a man of genuine imperial vision, and that was defeated finally not by the superiority of its rival's strategy, but by a government that couldn't sustain the patience the strategy required. The legacy of the French East India Company is visible in the places it left behind. Pondicherry, now Puducherry, the Union Territory of India, still carries the marks of its French period in its urban geography. The White Town Grid, its street name still in French on government signage alongside Tamil and English, its colonial buildings still housing cafes and boutique hotels that cater to tourists who come specifically for the French colonial atmosphere. This is the physical survivor of what Colbert imagined and Martin built and Dupleix governed. The French influence in Pondicherry is not merely nostalgic. The French language is still spoken by a small community. The Lycée Français is still operating. The Institut Français de Pondicherry conducts research in Indology. The colonial past is present in ways that are genuinely lived rather than merely displayed. Chandernagore, near Kolkata in West Bengal, the French settlement in Bengal that Dupleix had governed before Pondicherry, preserves a smaller but similarly distinctive French colonial atmosphere. The strand along the Hooghly River, with its French-influenced architecture, the Institut de Chandernagore with its collection of objects from the French colonial period, the Church of the Sacred Heart built in the French colonial style. These are the physical remnants of what was once the most commercially successful of the French India settlements. Lorient, the city on the Breton coast that Colbert built specifically as the French East India Company's home port, bears the company's name in its very identity, Lorient, and its history is inseparable from the company's. The city was almost entirely destroyed by Allied bombing in the Second World War, during which it was the main base for German U-boat operations, and was rebuilt in a modernist style that left little of the original company infrastructure standing. But the museum that preserves the history of the French East India Company, housed in a reconstructed section of the original company buildings, is one of the most serious and most informative museums in France of its kind. A physical memory of what was, before Wandiwash and the Treaty of Paris, a genuine commercial and imperial enterprise. The sepoys are perhaps the most consequential legacy. Dupleix's innovation of training Indian soldiers in European military methods and organizing them into European-style battalions, a practice he began systematically in the 1740s, was immediately adopted by the British East India Company, which recognized its value the moment they saw it in action on the Carnatic battlefields. The British sepoy armies that conquered India in the late 18th and early 19th centuries were built on the template that Dupleix had developed. The method of using local military manpower trained in European technique and motivated by European standard pay To project European power across a vast subcontinent at manageable cost was the method that made the British Indian Empire possible. Dupleix invented it. Britain benefited from it. This is one of those ironies of colonial history that the standard British Empire narrative finds inconvenient and tends to omit. The islands that the French company colonized, Bourbon and Ile-de-France, today's Réunion and Mauritius, are perhaps the most purely positive part of the company's physical legacy, in the sense that the archipelago of Indian Ocean islands where French colonial culture took root produced communities of extraordinary cultural complexity and survival. Réunion remains a French overseas department today, its population of nearly 1 million people, the product of centuries of mixing between French colonists, African enslaved people, Indian indentured workers, and Malagasy communities, producing a Creole culture of distinctive vibrancy. Mauritius, independent since 1968, but retaining French as one of its official languages alongside Creole and English, carries a similarly rich colonial inheritance. The coffee that the company first cultivated on Bourbon, the sugar that replaced it in the 18th century, the slave trade that the company organized to supply the labor for these plantation economies, all of these are part of the company's legacy in ways that the romantic story of Dupleix and the Carnatic Wars tends to obscure. The slave trade that the French East India Company conducted, purchasing enslaved Africans in Madagascar and along the East African coast, and transporting them to Bourbon and Ile-de-France to work the coffee and sugar plantations that the company was developing, was integral to the commercial logic of the company's island operations and was, by the mid-18th century, a major component of its business. The same company that was trying to build a territorial empire in India through military genius and political manipulation was simultaneously organizing the systematic forced migration of thousands of African people to island plantations that it was developing for profit. These two stories are not separate. They are the same story, told from different vantage points, and the French East India Company's history cannot be honestly told without telling both. The story of the French East India Company is, among other things, a story about the differences between two models of capitalist enterprise, the privately directed company and the state-directed one, and those differences played out across a century in ways that illuminate something enduring about the relationship between commercial logic and political logic. The French state always believed it knew better than the market what France needed from its India trade. Sometimes it was right. Colbert's diagnosis of France's commercial underdevelopment was accurate, and his intervention did produce a company that would not otherwise have existed, but the state's capacity to sustain the discipline that commercial success required, to fund losing operations long enough to develop them, to accept the patience that building an Indian territorial empire demanded, was always limited by the political considerations that a trading company answerable to shareholders does not face. The British company's shareholders, when they were unhappy, expressed their displeasure commercially by selling their shares or withholding further investment. The French company's political overseers, when they were unhappy, expressed their displeasure politically by recalling the men who were winning and replacing them with men whose initiatives they could understand. The irony is that by the 19th century the British East India Company had itself become so politically powerful, so entangled with the British state, so much a political actor in its own right alongside its commercial identity, that the British Parliament abolished it in 1858 after the Indian Mutiny and took direct Crown control of India. The privately directed company model that had beaten the French state-directed model in the 18th century was itself superseded by direct state administration in the 19th. The outcome that the British company's victory over the French company had produced British India, was eventually governed by exactly the kind of state bureaucracy that Colbert had tried to build a century earlier, and which he had been criticised for building. The specific form of state involvement mattered less, in the end, than the industrial and military power that lay behind it. Britain's state was richer, better organised, and more capable of sustaining military operations at global scale than France's was in the 1750s. That, more than any difference in the form of the commercial enterprise, is what determined the outcome. The night is settling around you now, and the long story of France's forgotten trading empire has reached its proper end, which was for the company the auction block in 1769, when its assets were sold off and its possessions absorbed by the crown, and for French India, the quiet handover to India in 1954, when the last French tricolour was lowered over Pondicherry. But the traces run deeper than formal endings. They run through the street plan of a city in Tamil Nadu where the road signs are in French. They run through the ruins of a trading post on the Hooghly River, where a small community still tends the memory of what was once the most profitable French settlement in Asia. They run through the military tradition of the sepoy, whose organisational form a French governor-general invented and whose spirit sustained one of the largest armies in the history of the world. They run through the counterfactual of what might have been if a government in Paris had trusted the vision of the man it recalled instead of flinching at the bill. The French East India Company was not a success story in the conventional sense. It was undercapitalised from its founding, structurally handicapped by the relationship between commercial enterprise and state direction, financially traumatised by the Mississippi bubble, and ultimately outcompeted in the decisive confrontation of the 7 Years' War by a rival whose private commercial character gave it the flexibility and the resources that the French company could never quite match. But within that framework of qualified failure, within the story of a company that always needed more money than it had, and always found its best initiatives undermined by a government that didn't understand them, there was Dupleix, and Dupleix very nearly changed everything. That is what makes it the story it is. Not the failure, which was overdetermined and in retrospect unsurprising, but the near success, which was genuinely contingent and which required only a little more patience, a little more trust, a little more willingness to sustain a vision whose full dimensions the people who pulled the plug had never quite understood. The ship still left Lorient every year, rounding the Cape and running before the trades toward India. The company's agent still sat in the White Town at Pondicherry, watching the ships come in. The sepoys still drilled on the Maidan in the evening light. And somewhere in the French archives, in a petition that Dupleix wrote and rewrote across the decade of his bitter retirement, the argument is still being made that France had been within reach of something extraordinary, and that the men who recalled him had thrown it away. Let that settle around you now. The Indian Ocean is dark tonight, and the Cape of Good Hope is far, and the trades are blowing, and Lorient is quiet, and Pondicherry is sleeping. The White Town grid with its French street signs is still there, patient as stone. The museum in Lorient is closed for the night, its maps and porcelain and company ledgers kept safe in the dark. The company is gone, the dream is gone, the places remain. Rest easy.